My name is Kimmo Burgis. I work as an enterprise architect at Microsoft Services here in Finland. Some of you may know me. I've been at Microsoft for about 12 years. I've only been at Services for less than a year now. I used to be responsible for everything that has to do with security, not just in terms of mobility, but for all the Microsoft products here in Finland. And this is kind of left over from my previous role or roles. I work as an enterprise architect, which means that I actually worked with some of our larger organizational customers and work on their ID strategy or enterprise architecture. That's my main role. So I'm not, my developer days are long over. The only way I develop software now is as a hobby and on a whiteboard. But I'm going to talk now about Windows Phone security from a developer perspective. I gave this same or a similar talk about 3 hours ago to a more IT pro audience. So in a way this is going to be similar, but I'm going to look at things from more a software developer view than from an IT pro view. I will, however, look at same kind of things in the beginning. There's a few things that even developers need to understand about the architecture of the Windows Phone OS and the software architecture on Windows Phone devices. That's one thing that I'm going to cover in the beginning. Another thing that I'm going to cover that may be a bit general or generic is I'm going to look at Marketplace, because basically when you look at Windows Phone devices from a developer perspective, the only way that you can get your application to be deployed onto the devices is through Marketplace. That is the only. We had a long talk or a long discussion about this in the previous talk. But basically, Marketplace is the only way, and you need to understand how it works, how that process really works. So that's basically going to be the contents of this talk. I'm going to talk about risks. There are some, when you look at mobility and you look at mobile devices, there are some risks associated with those devices. First of all, there's the device itself. You need to protect a few things on the device itself. Things like methods that provide network connectivity, right? Things like wireless LAN, which is a standard thing on a Windows Phone device, or the normal phone network connections. But similarly, all Windows Phone devices are actually equipped with a Bluetooth stack. There needs to be a method of protecting that as well. So you need to protect the connections to the device. You also must be able to protect, in some form or another, the connections that you make out of the device, right? The idea in Windows Phone devices is that for the majority of applications that you use on that device, the majority of the data that a particular application uses actually comes from, quote-unquote, the cloud. It comes to the device, to that particular application, through a connection to a back-end server. That back-end server may be one of the live services, it may be something like Exchange, it can be something like SharePoint, or it can be just a normal web services connection that you download data over. So you need to be able to protect those connections, and there's a whole multitude of aspects that you need to think about. Then you need to be able to protect the connection when the connection is formed. The server needs to be able to say, okay, it is really Kimmo that is logging on to this server. So you need to have some kind of an authentication method to do that. You need to be able, because the majority of these devices are actually going to be out on the public internet. You need to be able to protect the data while it's in transit from the server to the actual device. So there needs to be a way to do that. Now, granted, most of the connections that you make out of the device are actually going to be HTTP connections. There are other things that you could do as well. But the majority, if you look at the Windows Phone device, as you get it, the software they get on it when you buy it, all the connections actually are made over a HTTP connection. ActiveSync, which is the sync protocol between Exchange and the Outlook client, that's a HTTP connection. UAG, if you want to use UAG to publish your SharePoint sites from your intranet internal network, the UAG server can be used for that. That connection is a HTTPS connection. So the majority of the connections are HTTP, which makes things maybe slightly easier. But nonetheless, you need to be able to protect the data while it is in transit, and that generally it means HTTPS. So you have to be able to do an SSL protected connection from the device to the server and back. And thirdly, in some cases, not always, not even nearly always, but in some cases, you need to be able to protect the data when it is actually on the device. Now, there's stuff that the operating system will do for you, but in some cases, you will deem that data that is stored on the device itself is so valuable, or it is so sensitive, that it needs to be encrypted on the device. That's something that the device or the operating system will not do for you. So that's a decision that an application developer makes. There's APIs that you can use for that, but the device won't do that for you. So those are all things that are related to the data. And there's also other stuff, other kinds of risks that you need to be able to mitigate on the device itself. You need to be able to protect the device itself from malicious software. Right? Well, that's where Marketplace and the actual application model comes in play. That is the way that we protect a Windows Phone device from malicious software. You can only install and run software of a particular type on the device itself, and it can only come from one source. As I said earlier, that's Marketplace. And then there's also, lastly, maybe a bit more on the IT pro or the IT organization's side. You need to be able to protect generally the data. You must be able to wipe that device in case you lose it. If I happen to lose my phone, our IT organization is able to wipe the device. That really has nothing to do with developers as such. And I, as the user of that particular device, can actually do the wipe as well in a whole multitude of ways. So there's a lot of risks associated with a mobile device. And there's basically two different ways that on a Windows Phone device these risks are mitigated. The first way or method is that the OS or the system itself will do that for you. It will do that for the developer. It will do that for the user. A lot of the things that I just spoke about when it comes to risks, those risks are actually mitigated or addressed by the system itself. Marketplace, the application model, the fact that the device actually protects the applications from one another. So if you get an application on my device, I don't really care that much what you do with that application, because your application, whatever way you program it, it can't affect any other application on that particular device. Those are all things that the system does for you, either through the architecture itself, the way that things are just set up, and the way that things are done on a Windows Phone device, or through some kind of functionality that the device provides or does not provide, as it is in the case of protecting the applications from each other. So that's one thing that you need to be aware of. And the reason you need to be aware of these issues that, or things that the platform itself does. As a software developer, you need to be aware of them kind of from two different angles. One, of course, is that there's stuff that you don't need to worry about. Right? You don't need to code that in your application. The system does it for you. But the second thing why you need to be aware of those things is because they pose limitations to you and your application. There are things that you cannot do. Like, surprisingly enough, on the previous session that I did for more an IT Pro perspective, somebody asked me whether an application can send email. Can you program a piece of software, an application that is able to send email? And the answer is sure. There is an API in the .NET library that you use on the Windows mobile applications that will allow you to send email. So that's something that's provided for you. But you need to be aware of the limitations. You will use the API basically is a function call, a task, a launcher task as we call them, that will launch the normal Outlook application. It will open a window for the user, and it will pass some parameters to that, some set of data to that window. Basically, the set of recipients for that particular piece of email, the subject line, and the body text. And that's it. Is there limitations to this? Sure. There's a limitation. You cannot send attachments. You cannot use that to send attachments. Right? So that's the reason why you need to be aware of the stuff that is kind of on the first bullet. The second bullet, or the second point, or step to mitigate some of the risks is these are decisions that you make as a developer. An example of these would be, my data is valuable or it's sensitive. Even though the memory on a Windows Phone device is protected, it isn't encrypted. I'll come to that in a minute. There's a subtle difference between these two. It isn't encrypted, but you may, as a software developer, make the decision and say, okay, I want my data encrypted. What does that mean? It means that you need to use an API. Well, that's one thing. The second thing is you need to store the keys for that encryption somewhere, or you need to provide a salt for the encryption key, maybe through a password or a passcode or a PIN code or whatever. That which will create a situation where the actual key used to encrypt the data is not actually stored on the device itself. Right? So these are things that you may decide you want to do in order to mitigate some kind of a risk on the phone. So I'll touch on those a bit, and I'll also tell you where you can find some more or additional information for that. And then there are some additional things a developer can do. As a third step, if you're a .NET developer, there's stuff that you can do. We've created some tools you can do that will allow you to enhance the security of that particular .NET application. They're very fairly well known. There's also a full kind of a framework on how you would do security, how security would be part of your application development process. That's something that we developed at Microsoft for our own use some years ago. It's called SDL, and even though it is designed for Microsoft, it's created by our people for our particular software development process. And actually, there are various forms of that definition, even within Microsoft. Some people come to me and say, "Hey, listen, you know, that's far too far too heavy, far too complicated for a normal software developer. Granted, that's true. However, there are things that you probably could learn from that. We've been developing that process for the past 12 years. There's a lot of individual things and ways of thinking and tools, at least, that you can learn from that process. I'll touch it at the very end if we're lucky. So that's kind of the agenda for the talk. Those are the things that I'm going to be talking about. We'll see how far we get within the next 45 minutes. I actually ran 45 minutes over in the session I did earlier in the morning. It was a good thing that it was lunch, so I wasn't taking anybody else's time. But there was a lot of questions that came up, and please, if you have any questions, ask them. You can ask them at any time. Just normal method. Show your hand, ask a question. I'll answer it if I can. Otherwise, I'll run away. And then, if you have additional questions, some things that I haven't been able to answer, there's my email address. So please feel free to send me email. So there. So platform. What are the things that the platform does you from a software developer perspective? The first thing is that there's a controlled approach to install applications onto the device. And this kind of touches on two different things. One is the applications are all managed code. You cannot install or run a native code application on the Windows Phone platform unless you're Microsoft. That's it. You can't even within the managed code application, you cannot invoke native code. There's a lot of .NET APIs that you cannot use. You can't invoke native code. There's another whole set of APIs that will allow you to do file management on the device, but they're not file I/O. There's a separate thing for that. So there's a lot of things that you can't do that would be possible even for a normal managed code application. But nonetheless, all the applications that are run on the Windows Phone platform are managed code. The second thing that this touches on is, again, something I already said. You can only install applications through Marketplace. And now somebody's going to say that is not absolutely true, and it is not absolutely 100% true. That is right. If you're a developer, you can actually unlock a phone by registering to Microsoft. As you all probably know, if you've done Windows Phone application development, you can unlock a phone, but that will require that you register to Microsoft. If you're a normal software developer, that will cost you a fee, which is $100 a year, and then you will be able to unlock a number of phones to do a number of things. For example, install applications directly onto that device. But in general, the rule is everything is installed through Marketplace, which is very important. It's very important for security. That's the way we control that nothing, that's the way we try to control that nothing malicious actually gets on the device itself. I'm a security person. I'm paranoid by nature. That's something that security people, it's probably in their genes or something. And I'm not going to tell you that it will be impossible, because nothing in security is 100%. But that is one of the ways that we're trying to control that nothing malicious gets onto the device. Those are two important things. I'll touch on those in a bit more detail in a few moments. The second thing is that once you get your application onto the device itself, the user installs it, downloads it from Marketplace, and installs it on the device. What happens is that the operating system will create a sandbox for that application. And it will define the boundaries of that sandbox. It will define the rights for that sandbox or that particular application. And then after that, it will control that the application doesn't actually go over those boundaries, or it doesn't go over the rights that we've assigned for that particular application. So that's the OS's job. Third thing that the OS does is it will control to a certain extent what data, but especially how that data can be copied onto the device. There's basically two ways of getting data onto a Windows Phone device. You cannot copy stuff over. If you connect it to a PC with a USB cable, it won't show up as a memory device. That's not allowed. One of the security features in the phone itself. So basically the only two ways of getting stuff onto that, data onto that device, is either by programming that logic into the application itself, or using some other application, such as maybe web. You could do that to a certain extent. Get stuff onto the device itself. Or the second thing is you can use Zune, but Zune is only limited to media files, videos, audio files, and pictures. So basically, if you develop an application and you want to get data onto the device, you will have to code that data transfer, the logic for that data transfer, into the application itself. It will have to come from, as I said, the idea is that the data comes from some server in the cloud, as we call it nowadays. In other words, a back-end server somewhere. And then the fourth thing is we do, to a certain extent, control access to that data that you get on the device. The basic rule, as I said, is you can't go over outside of the sandbox. Your application runs in the sandbox, and it has its own isolated storage area where it will store the data that you copy over the network using your own self-programmed logic. You cannot pass that data on as an application to another application. Neither can another application access your isolated storage. That boundary is a security boundary between two applications. So those are the things that the operating system does for you. Go ahead.
So what's the maximum size of application I can install there if I just use the developer?
There's a maximum size for an application that you can deploy through Marketplace, and if I'm not mistaken, it's 225 megabytes.
But I meant like not through Marketplace, just directly to the device.
How much data can you store in that isolate? Is that the question? How much data can you store into an application?
Yeah.
There is no quota for the isolated storage. If you look at the MSDN guidelines for developers when you're using isolated storage, it goes something like developers are expected to use storage responsively. Right? There is no quota. The operating system does not impose a quota on how much data you can store into your own isolated storage. But because we don't know what your requirements may be, you may have to store 10 gigabytes or something. But please be responsible when you do that. There's a limited amount of storage within a Windows Phone device. Software architecture is pretty straightforward. This looks like almost any kind of an operating system that I know of could actually be looking at that architecture model. The only things that are really important are the application components, which are here. There's really only one framework that you can use to code stuff onto the phone itself, install on the phone itself, and that is basically .NET. It will run on top of a CLR, which is kind of the mini. It's not the full CLR. It's the mini, basically the one that is from Silverlight. And then the other type of an application, of course, is HTML and JavaScript that will run within the browser, the IE mobile version on the Windows Phone device. There's a lot of stuff underneath that. For example, there's a lot of APIs here that you can use to access things like location data, or you can access some of the sensors. not all of them, but some of them. You can even access the Bluetooth APIs, but Windows Phone only supports certain types of Bluetooth profiles, so you can't transfer data over Bluetooth. The only exception to that is the information about your people or your connections to whatever you happen to call them. So the connection information, for example, for your connections in the People Hub, but so that's pretty straightforward. Some concepts when it comes to application model. The application packages, they're what we call XAP packages or XAML applications. They basically contain three different things. There's two kinds of stuff within the XAP package itself. There's the application logic, the VLLs, and any data that you want to install with the application itself into your isolated storage. And there's a bunch of metadata. And this metadata basically is used by the developer to describe, tell Marketplace for one, and the phone itself as the second part, what capabilities you want to access or that application needs to access within the phone. Things like if you need the location information or you need a microphone for some reason. You want to be able to access calendar information. You want to be able to access contact information from the user's People Hub. All of these things are capabilities, and those capabilities have to be stated in the metadata. And what we'll actually do as part of the certification process is that we'll look at the application, and we'll look at the metadata, and we'll go, do these match? So if you've oversubscribed, if you say I need location, but you don't actually need it, we're going to go, that's probably something we want to tell you about, but in general, that's not going to prevent you from putting that application into Marketplace. However, it may prevent the user from installing that application, because then that metadata is used also during the actual installation process. If you need location information, the user needs to opt in for that information. The user needs to say, yeah, sure, I'll allow this application to access that location information. If the user says no, then the application won't be installed. That was an example of this that somebody had created, or oversubscribed rather heavily. They had made a flashlight application that required location data. Well, the user's logic might actually go, I don't know of any flashlight that would require that would really need to know where I am. Okay, so, but that won't prevent it. So that's the stuff that is included in the XAP file as well. Or what happens after you do that? You'll basically send the application or upload the application to Marketplace. That application will be certified. It will be signed. We will create a certificate for that application, and that's the third part. So when the application is actually installed by the user to a particular device, this stuff is installed, but that goes there as well, certificate, and that's something that we can actually revoke. So if you decide that your application is what would be the good word? Is not behaving correctly, then you can tell us that please revoke the license for my application. Revoke the certificate. And that will prevent that application from being run on any of the devices that it's been installed. It has been installed on. Right? Any questions so far?
Any style of application now requires
Yes. It won't need to do it all the time. I think the limit is 20. I think it's 24 hours. It will need to look at the CRIL or the certificate certificate revocation list from a server, from our servers. But it will need that connection to Marketplace anyway, because it will check for updates the same way. But I think it's every 24 hours, if I'm not mistaken. So basically, the deployment process is this: you develop, you debug, blah blah blah. You ingest, you send that stuff. When you're finished with it, you send it to Marketplace. Of course, again, here you have to register for that. We'll certify, we'll sign, and then it goes on to Marketplace. These are two things that I'll talk more about. And then the user makes a decision. Okay, yeah, I want this application. No, I don't. Yeah. Then they click on it in Marketplace. They install it. And this process is similar for every application that you want installed. It doesn't matter whether it's a free application for Helsingin Sanomat, or it's a free application for Helsinki traffic information, or a paid application, or an application for an organizational use. They all go through the same process. There is no other way of getting an application onto a Windows Phone device. That was one of the longest things that we actually had a discussion during the session I did previously, because if you look at it, organizations probably want to control this in one form or another, because that's the way they've always done it. But the truth of the matter is, there is no other way currently. Will that change? Don't know. Don't think so. The reason for that is that that's the way that we control that nothing malicious gets onto the device. So there. Wow. Nice slide transitions. Certification. What does that actually mean? What do we check? We actually check a whole multitude of things. Mostly, most of these are actually done through automation. One is a quality check, and this is there's stuff that happens from a technical perspective. We will check that the application installs. We will check that the application behaves correctly in a case that an exception is raised against that application. For example, what happens if you require location information in your application, right? In Windows Phone, there's two decisions that the user can make. The user will make a decision for that particular application at install time, whether they want it or not. If they do say yeah, that application gets installed. But the user can also make that decision device-wide. There's a thing in the settings where you can say, I don't want any location information passed to any application. And your application needs to handle that gracefully. If it doesn't, it won't pass the certification. Most of these technical checks are actually things that you can do. You can also do through tools within Visual Studio or one of the other application development environments for Windows Phone. So you can actually do them yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
What means well written here?
Well written code. There's a whole list of things. For example, handling exceptions gracefully is well written code. We're not actually going to say that your code is not well written because we want the curly braces to start a line in C#, which is a kind of a discussion that always happens. That's not what we mean. We have a certain set of rules. You need to abide by a certain set of rules when it comes to security. We'll check those. You have to abide by a certain set of rules from a code perspective. Exceptions is one example. You have to abide by a certain set of rules when it comes to the fact that the metadata and the application itself actually must match. So if your application uses one of the location APIs, and we can check that because it's managed code, so it's actually MSIL, so we'll see all the stuff where we can check them. And you haven't declared that in your metadata, it will fail certification. But again, there's a tool. There's actually a tool to run that's included in Visual Studio, and you can use that tool to run through your code, and it will tell you what list of capabilities you need to declare within the metadata itself. So most of these things you can check for yourself as well. But basically, the rule is that we will check against a lot of things, and if you don't pass those checks, then we won't allow you to publish that application within Marketplace. Those are all documented, by the way. There's a link at the end of this, and there's a whole list of those. There's a lot of checks that we do from a content perspective. This has to more do with things like age limits. There's certain type of content that needs to be declared that it is adult only content. If your application provides that type of content, if you go to Marketplace, there's applications that do provide that type of content. You need to declare that, right? So that we can show it in Marketplace, because Marketplace is generic and it's actually based, whatever is shown in that application description within Marketplace is that's driven by the metadata that you provide. So you need to declare that this application provides adult content. Or games is another thing where age limits are of a concern. And then again, there is a certain set of size criteria. As far as I remember, I think the size, Valda, can you verify this? The size of an application that you put into Marketplace currently, the maximum size is 225 megabytes.
250.
Is it 250? Okay. I said 225. I thought it was 225.
I'm not sure. I think it's 250.
Okay, go on. Well, it's somewhere in the if you look at Marketplace, most of the applications are actually fairly small. They're about 1 or 2 megabytes in size. It's actually the data that you want to use with that application that will take most of the space. There was a question back there. Did anybody have a question? Okay, fine. Excellent. And then there's a commercial check. There are certain types of applications that we don't actually allow. Basically, the commercial check more has to do with the fact that if you declare within Marketplace that this application costs a certain amount of money, that application cannot incur additional charges after you've installed it. So basically, the commercial check, for the most part, is that we require you again to declare the cost for an application, and there can't be anything hidden, right? Sorry?
225 is all right.
Oh, good. So my adult memory is not gone completely haywire. Okay. Distribution options is one of the things that you need to decide when you put an application or deploy an application into Marketplace. Basically, there's three different ways for Marketplace to distribute applications. It actually happens the same way, but the distinction is, first of all, whether the application is public, so it's visible within Marketplace to anybody, and it is searchable. You can actually make rules here where you say an application is only available in a certain country. How do we make that decision? How do we decide? Well, it's based on Live ID. So Live ID has a hard-coded country. You can't change that afterwards. It's hard. You select it when you create that Live ID, and you can't change it afterwards. For example, mine is for a certain number of reasons, is Ireland. So I can't install the application for Nordea online banking because that's Finland only. The limitation is Finland only. So you can do stuff like that here. You can say that it is for everybody. You can say that there are no limitations. Or you can say that it's limited to a certain set of geographies, but you can limit it as well. You can also say that it's paid or free, and then if it's paid, then certain things apply to that application. But another thing that you can decide is you can also say that it's targeted, which means that it's hidden. It's still in Marketplace, but it's hidden. And in order to install that piece of application, you need to as a user, you need to receive a link to it. Right? So this is the way that most organizations nowadays are actually deploying applications. They're deployed into Marketplace, but they're hidden. And then, for example, in our case, we will receive a link to that application in some way. I'll come to that in a bit more. So that's another thing that you can decide. And then the third thing is you can actually do a beta applicate or deploy a beta application onto Marketplace as well, where basically there's two limitations. Well, three. It has to be free. It can't be paid for. There's a limited number of users. You can actually limit it to a certain Windows Live ID, but there can be only 100 of them. That's one of the things that we've been asked for. Is could we do the same thing for targeted? So you understand the link itself. That's not a security boundary. If I receive a link as Microsoft person and I'm a bit malicious, I can send it to him. And Marketplace won't actually make any distinction between me and him. He can still install it, even though it's internal. I'll come to that. That actually means something from a security perspective. But this is not a security boundary. And we've always been asked for, could we do Windows Live ID based limitations even on the targeted one. The reason we don't do that currently is that we don't have the capacity. We don't have the capacity to do the authentication on Marketplace's side. Yeah, go ahead.
Why not unique IDs that expires, for example, in 2 hours, 1 hour?
Well, again, that would mean that we would actually have to code that into Marketplace. We don't have the capacity to do that. The number of downloads and installations from Marketplace is pretty vast. So we just don't have the capacity to do that. We could do a lot of things. But I'll come to that in a minute, because there are ways of getting kind of around this. For example, Microsoft has created a piece of application which is called Apps for Work. That is an application that you install on your device, and then that application will authenticate you against our servers. So only the people that have a valid Microsoft user ID and password can get the data. And what does that application then download? Well, it downloads a list of applications and links to Marketplace. And then when you click one of those, it will actually transfer control over to Marketplace and install that particular targeted application. So there are ways that you can actually get around to it and actually code an application for that if you wanted to do that for a particular organization. If you want more information on that, I can certainly help you. App lifecycle. Well, there's basically only two things that are kind of important here. One is the user controls install, update, and uninstall. So the application cannot update itself. It cannot change the code that it runs. That update comes from Marketplace. You cannot code into the application logic that will allow you to update the code. You won't. The application won't run. You can't actually install that either. So the updates come from Marketplace, and they're always user initiated. The user makes that decision. The only decision that the application developer can make is revoking the license, which means that we won't actually remove anything from the device. We will just prevent that particular application from running. So if you have like the previous example that I used, you as an application developer can say, okay, well, my application is misbehaving in some way. You'll get in touch with Microsoft and say, please, will you revoke the license for this? And then you provide an update to Marketplace. What will happen? Well, that application will get updated. And because it will, during that update, it will get a new license and a new certificate. It will actually be able to run. The user will be able to run it again. And that application will then be able to access the same data that the user had already created before you notice that your application is doing stuff that it shouldn't be doing. So we don't remove. We prevent from running. And that's the reason That's the reason for it. Well, what happens when you install an application? Basically, what I said earlier, a sandbox is created. That sandbox will actually contain a host process that will run the CLR like a normal .NET application, but it will run that CLR for that application only. So when you install, we base the sandbox actually on stuff that is generic. We'll give you the host process. We'll give you an isolated storage. But then what we'll actually also do is we'll give you a set of usage rights or rights for that application. And those rights are based on what is it that you want to do. Well, first of all, principle, that is the application itself. Second of all, what is it that you want to do? What is the resource that you want to use? Location information, microphone, calendar information, and so on. And then the third thing in this kind of equation is whether you can or not, or a more specific right. So in the case of, for example, in the case of location information, it's basically an on-off decision. You can or you can't. There's no way of saying, well, I can use it in Sweden, but I can't use it in Finland. Whereas, for example, for contact information, you could say, well, you can access it, but you can't update it. Both of these will actually go through the operating system of the APIs anyway. But they can control that you can access, but you can't update, you can't create new, and so on. So there. So there's some things that I've already talked about. Most of this is actually stuff that is not that important to you. Basically, there's only two things that are of interest to a software developer here. One is the synchronization of application data onto the device is controlled. You can either do it through a server connection, a HTTPS connection from your application itself, or you can rely on Zune. But Zune will only synchronize media data. It will only synchronize pictures or audio files or video files. It won't sync anything else. Zune won't sync documents. It won't sync your email and so on. That's one thing that you need to be you kind of need to be aware of. And the second thing that you need to be aware of is stuff that I already talked about. If you consider your data valuable or sensitive, then you can protect it. The operating system actually protects the data so that I will be back. Just talking to the cameraman at the back because he's going haywire now. So if you get access to this device, the question is, can you get access to the stuff that is on this device? Well, it's pin code protected. That's kind of the start. So if you type in the pin code, the wrong pin code 4 times, the device will actually wipe itself. That's our security policy. It's controlled over ActiveSync. And the second thing is, you can't get access to the memory. The only way you can get access to the memory and the data in the memory is if you disassemble this phone into pieces and try to get hold of the memory itself. You can't access the memory through a PC or by booting this. You can't boot this into anything else or so on. So it is certainly probably possible that somebody can come in and basically put this thing, break this thing into pieces and access that memory. But I've always said that there's an easier there's a hacking method which is called the Magnum 45 method, which basically says that I as a hacker will come to you and nicely say, will you give me your PIN code? And I may use as a method of persuasion a Magnum 44 or 5, which is certainly a lot easier than actually, putting this thing into pieces and so on. So, but nevertheless, your data may be sensitive enough, it may be valuable enough that you want to protect it, and there is certainly an API that you can do that with. Guard against malware, again, a lot of things I've talked about. Basically, there's two things that we use for this. First of all, we control the types of applications that are allowed, and the only way the second thing is the only way to get them is through Marketplace. Secure access. Again, this is important from a developer perspective, because a lot of the stuff that you get on the phone, you need to get over a network connection. You need to protect that. Well, there's certain things that you can do in terms of authentication. You can use HTTPS certificates, even though there are some quirks to that. You can even use certificate in certain cases, not everywhere, but in certain cases you can use certificates even to authenticate the user. For a particular application that may be somewhat difficult, but if it happens to be a web application, you can do that. And the third thing is, which is not really written here, is you can code stuff in. I have some examples where some of our internal applications actually use federated authentication. Things like ADFS or SAML tokens within. It's not. There's very little documentation about this because it's kind of a workaround. It actually uses the web browser control in order to do this. But it is possible. If you require something like that, let me know and I'll provide you with the documentation. So that's it from the actual system perspective. So that's the first part. That's stuff that the system either does for you or provides for you. Right? Now there's a whole set of things that you as a developer need to do, because this is the second part. There's things that you need to decide, and there's things that you need to implement within your application. You need to adhere to all the policies, basically Marketplace. Use and declaration of capabilities being one example of this. You need to be using Marketplace. You need to make a decision on the distribution options. And remember that targeted is not a security boundary. What that means is, first of all, as I said, he can install an application if he gets hold of that link. It's not a link. It's actually good within the link itself. But still, if I get it through or over email or from a website, I can certainly email it to him. We as a Marketplace, we won't make any distinction between those two. Which actually brings me to another point. That means that you will, if you're using a backend server connection to get your data, you will need to be able to authenticate the user somehow. That's something that you need to code into the application. And there's various different things that you can do. You can do basic authentication over HTTPS. You can do form-based authentication through the web browser control. You can even do federated. You can do certificates in certain cases. But you will nonetheless need to do that. You need to protect your connections, which in most cases means that you need to use HTTPS to protect the hold on a second to protect the actual connection. Just do normal SSL, which means you can actually use either self-signed or commercial certificates in order to do that, but they need to be trusted. So if you use self-signed certificates to do HTTP connections to your server, that SSL, self-signed SSL certificate must be trusted, which means that you need to get the root certificate onto that device, which in most cases means that it is a lot easier to just use commercial. Well, there's another caveat to this. The commercial CAs or certificate providers that are automatically trusted on a Windows Phone device, they're actually not the same that we trust on normal Windows. The list is a lot shorter. I think there's 12 or 13 that are currently trusted automatically. So you need to make sure that your SSL certificate comes from one of those, and not, for example, from Sonera, unfortunately, which on the Windows platform, the desktop platform, is trusted, but it isn't in Windows Phone. That'll change. We've already said that we will change that process, but it won't change until the next version of the phone OS comes out. And that's the only thing I will say about the next version of the phone OS. Valgo is looking at me from hold on, at the back there. He's going to fire me if I say anything. Yes, go ahead.
The other question was about if my application uses HTTPS, can I use certificates are they automatically used for client authentication? If it's present.
The question basically, the question basically is if you use HTTPS, can you use client-side certificates to authenticate that connection? You're not going to like this answer. The answer is yes or no. Yes. The answer is yes if it's a web application. If you're using that application through the browser, the answer is yes. We will automatically use how will we make that connection to a client certificate? Well, it's first come, first served basis. So yes, in a web application, a browser application. No, if you're doing it there's no API for an application to say I want to use this client-side certificate for authentication.
If I use browser control,
Yes.
then yes.
Yes. I haven't actually tested that, but I do not. If you run into that, send me an email. I'd like to know the answer. As far as I know, the answer is yes, but I haven't actually tested that. That's a good point. We need to add that into our test case. But anyway, you need to provide user authentication, and then you need to protect your data. And again, here, if you protect the data, there is a crypto API on the device, so you can protect your data. But the thing that you need to remember is you need to either store the keys somewhere else, or provide for a logic of creating a key, which means that you need to ask the user for a PIN code or a password or blah, 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 whatever, for the data. Don't just store the key onto the device, because the problem is that that key is stored on the device unencrypted. It has to be. And that device doesn't provide for device level encryption. So you can do it, but you need to remember a few things. So that's things that you need to decide as a developer. There's a few things that you need to know about the certificates. Basically, it needs to be trusted, whether it's self-signed or commercial. If there's anything that you need when it comes to certificates, we actually have a whole bunch of test cases that we're running locally here, because this is one of the biggest problems that we've run against when it comes to using Windows Phone in an organizational environment. We've run into hundreds of cases where people can't get their certificates to work properly when they're doing active synchronization of their email. I know they do work, but it's just a question of getting them working properly. And then there's the other stuff. Normal rules still apply. So everything that you asked about, what was the word? Good code or proper code. All those rules still apply, insofar as they actually do apply for .NET codes or .NET program code. And then you have to familiarize yourself with SDL, or you should, because, as I said, this is basically the process that we're using for our own software development process. Every application that Microsoft produces, if it fulfills one of two criteria. One is it makes a network connection. Two is if it stores PII, or personally identifiable information. That application, no matter how insignificant or how trivial a piece of code it is, it has to go through this process. And there's a lot of things that you can learn from this, albeit it is a process that is designed for Microsoft, by Microsoft for Microsoft, but there's a lot of things that you can learn. If you go to Microsoft.com SDL, that's where you find all the all the information. Actually, a lot of the tools that we've developed over the years are included within Visual Studio itself. So there, a whole bunch of additional information. I've actually done this exactly in an error, which is probably the world record for this particular talk. If there's any questions, please ask them now.